Thank you for joining us. The Trump administration is standing firm on its immigration policies. It comes as the Department of Homeland Security began flying migrants away from the border last week. So far, hundreds have been flown from Texas to holding cells in California. Officials had previously said those plans could expand. Border Patrol had notified other U.S. cities they might expect an influx. This included counties in Florida, as well as Detroit, Michigan, and Buffalo, New York. However, the acting U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security says those areas are no longer in consideration. Kevin McAleenan sat down with Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation Sunday.
We looked at it from a planning perspective. What's prudent here? We do have stations in Florida. We have stations on the northern border. They're very small stations. They have a few agents that are busy patrolling their areas. It wasn't going to be an effective use of resources. But yeah, we had to look at all options. When you have 16,000 people in custody and facilities designed for many fewer, you've got to look at any planning factor you can.
And you acknowledge that they were officials from your own agency who said that this was indeed going to happen in Florida.
U.S. Customs and Border Protection
Detroit, Buffalo, and Miami.
U.S. Customs and Border Protection did notify officials locally in those areas that they were looking at the possibility of doing this. That's correct.
Okay. And those cities are also off the table now?
Correct.
Okay.
Those comments came as the president defended his immigration policies. He claimed Saturday without evidence that Democrats are trying to, quote, force migrants into the U.S., tweeting, "Our country is full." Edward Wong joins me now from Washington. He's a diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times. Edward, thanks so much for being with us. The administration says that it is flying migrants from the border due to overcrowding. Could you put this into context for us? How realistic a solution is this to solve the problem?
Well, I think that the root cause of the problem is instability and economic crises in Central American countries. And so the administration had said several weeks ago that they were going to cut off all aid to 3 countries in Central America. Now, critics of that policy say that they're shooting themselves in the foot if their ultimate aim is to address the migrants coming north towards U.S. and Canada, that what you need to do is to address the economic instability in those countries and to sort of help with aid packages and help with other policies within the countries that can really provide, stable economy, stable security in the countries, and that the administration really needs to step that up. I think that flying migrants around to different cities in the U.S. Might be one way to alleviate crowding some centers in Texas, but it doesn't ultimately address the root cause of the problem.
Well, we heard Acting Secretary McAleenan say before that Florida is off the table for receiving migrants, and this comes after the state's Republican governor, Ron DeSantis, voiced strong pushback. Do we know, Edward, if that had any impact on the decision not to go ahead with this plan?
Well, I think that that obviously is taken into account. If you have states and cities pushing back, then it would be very hard, I think, for the executive branch to really impose that. And I think that there could be lawsuits that come up, and that would lead to protracted fights. As well, it would also complicate sort of the immigration messaging that President Trump wants to send as he's campaigning for re-election. So I think he wants to try and keep it a clear-cut issue. It's been one that appeals to his base, and so he doesn't want to have it muddied up with fights with executives from different states.
I'd like to turn now to the escalating tensions with Iran. The U.S. issued a warning this weekend to commercial airliners flying over the Persian Gulf. The FAA advised U.S. diplomats that these planes were at risk of being misidentified. Do we know what specifically prompted this?
Well, tensions with Iran have been escalating very quickly ever since May 5th, when John Bolton, the national security advisor, issued a statement telling Iran, don't attack either us, the U.S., any U.S. interests, or those of its allies, telling Iran not to do that, or telling any of the militias supported by Iran in the Middle East not to do that. And then he also said that the U.S. would speed up the deployment of an aircraft carrier and bombers to the Persian Gulf. So since then, there's been rapid escalation of tensions. And I think that the U.S. warning to airliners and airline companies is in keeping with this idea that there might be an increased threat level. We've heard politicians here in Washington say that they have gotten intelligence showing that there's more chatter, there's more activity between Iran and various militias that might support around the region. The question is like whether it's the administration's very hardline policies in Iran that have pushed Iran to this point. I think that some people who've looked at these policies have said it's been in the works, that it's sort of built into the administration hardline policies that they've been sort of trying to bait. Some people think that some administration officials like Bolton might be trying to bait Iran into taking action.
Yeah, and to follow up, so your paper, the New York Times, reported that some of the president's advisors disagree with him on how best to approach Iran. Mr. Trump has dismissed that notion, but what is at stake here, Edward, for the president as he weighs his next options?
Well, I think President Trump has made a very strong point of saying he doesn't want to be entangled in wars in the Middle East. A big part of his campaign and his messaging is to say we want to get our troops back to the U.S. We don't want more lives lost over in wars where the U.S. doesn't have paramount interests. And so I think he's trying to weigh that versus the advice of some of his more aggressive or hawkish officials, like John Bolton, like Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, who say, oh, what we need to do is take a very aggressive approach towards Iran because they have what these officials say an expansionist foreign policy. So the question is, are there U.S. interests in this region that would lead President Trump to want to put in more troops or to take a stronger military posture there against Iran? His instinct, I would say, is to not do that. He wants to pull troops back.
Sticking with foreign policy, the U.S. reached a deal to lift metal tariffs on Canada and Mexico Friday. That removes one key obstacle to getting the new trade deal among the three countries passed. But, Edward, what else needs to happen for Congress to actually get on board?
Well, one big sticking point that legislators have talked about is sort of having stronger labor protections in Mexico, for example. So unions here feel that there aren't strong enough labor protections in Mexico, and that allows labor costs to be undercut, and it also then undercuts the unions and labor representation and labor costs here in the United States. So Democratic legislators have been saying, for example, they want to see stronger labor regulations, labor rules in Mexico. They want this to be part of the agreement. And so I think we'll see some back and forth. Pelosi met with Lighthizer, the senior trade representative here in Washington this past week, and they discussed this. And there was some sign of potential optimism there, but I think the verdict's still out.
Well, also on the trade front, the president delayed imposing tariffs on automobile imports Friday. The move mainly impacts Europe and Japan. Mr. Trump set a deadline of 6 months to reach a deal before the levies would go into effect. How realistic, Edward, a timeline is that to finalize negotiations?
I think it's very hard to tell. I think, as you can tell with the negotiations with China, these talks can go on for a long time, and then they can be scrapped at the last minute. So it would be very, very hard in this administration to predict how long talks will take. They might decide that they don't, that they can just prolong the talks for a while. I think there's some people in the administration who think that it's better that Trump not sign a weak deal, and that going into the 2020 elections, he'll look stronger if he backs away from any deal where he can be widely criticized for sort of caving in or agreeing to weak options on the part of the U.S. So I think that that's a big question that looms over everything, the fact that we're so close to the election year now.
All right, before we let you go, I do have to ask about 2020. Former Vice President Joe Biden held a rally in Philadelphia Saturday. President Trump will also travel to Pennsylvania Monday. Can you tell us about their competing strategies in that crucial swing state?
Well, I think Trump will probably underscore the fact that his sort of management of the economy has helped, that the economy is still fairly strong, job growth has been strong, and that there haven't been any large stock market crashes, although the market does gyrate wildly these days. So I think that he will stress that, and he'll stress sort of his tough line on China and how that might be helping out the U.S. economy or trying to bring jobs back. Many economists disagree with his assertions on this, but this is what he'll say on the campaign trail. And he also will stress, I think, his aggressive and hardline stance on immigration and on asylum seekers, because I think he feels that that's sort of like a very winning issue for his base. Now, Biden has said that, has really stressed the message that he's campaigning explicitly to unseat Trump, and that voters must vote based on that, and that he's the best candidate to do that. Of all the sort of almost 24 or so Democratic candidates running, like, he's the best positioned person is his argument. So he'll be campaigning based on that line of argument.
All right, Edward Wong covering a range of issues for us on this day. Edward, thanks very much for your time.